All right, everybody, thanks so much for joining us this morning. I'm going to turn it over to CJ Park and Rebecca Schmidt to get us started. CJ, would you unmute yourself?
Thank you. Welcome, everyone, to the webinar, More Research Needed, How to Build an Evidence Base for Interventions to Support Post-Secondary Transitions in Rural Settings. Before we get started, we're going to do a very quick tour of Zoom features. I know everyone is very familiar with these probably, but just in case, we're going to look at them now. So chat, mute, minimize the little squares. We'll just put this up for a moment, as Laura said, be visible or not visible kind of at your own comfort level. So let's go ahead and get started. I'll review what agenda for today. As most of you know, this webinar is on the needs, barriers, and solutions.
CJ, you just got muted for some reason.
Okay, there we go. Very sorry for that. We're pleased to present this webinar on the needs, barriers, and solutions for conducting rigorous research in rural settings. This webinar builds on results of a study REL Appalachia did in response to a local need to identify evidence-based interventions to address non-academic barriers to post-secondary transition for students from high poverty rural communities. We hope this webinar will support policymakers, researchers, and funders in deepening their understanding of the need for and challenges to such research, as well as surfacing potential solutions. Our agenda for today will begin with a short introduction to the Regional Educational Laboratory Program. Then we'll provide an overview of the need for rigorous research in rural settings to support post-secondary transition, particularly around non-academic supports. Our guest speakers, Alan Pratt and Sherry Scott Horner, will share thoughts from a practitioner's perspective. Then REL Appalachia will provide an overview of the findings from our evidence review on the topic. We'll then move on to discussing challenges and potential solutions and end with a Q&A with the panel, including additional researcher voices from Ann Kern, Jennifer Ash, and Katie Kinninger, and Ann O'Connell from The Ohio State University. The Regional Educational Laboratory Program is administered by the U.S. Department of Education's Institute for Education Sciences. The 10 regional educational laboratories, or RELs, work in partnership with stakeholders to conduct applied research and trainings. Our work is part of REL Appalachia. We partner with a variety of state and local stakeholders in Kentucky, Tennessee, Virginia, and West Virginia to work on several education-related issues, including improving post-secondary transitions, early literacy, using data and evidence across states, and more. The work that we're speaking to today comes out of our Improving Post-Secondary Transitions Partnership work in rural Eastern Kentucky. Through the REL program, we carry out 3 main activities. We conduct a wide variety of applied research studies, provide educators and other stakeholders with training, coaching, and technical support needed to use research findings and evidence to improve teaching and learning, and disseminate findings from research in ways that educators and policymakers can use in practice. So in short, the REL program offers support to state education agencies, local education agencies, and schools that helps practitioners use evidence-based practices. This isn't one size fits all in our approach, and we at REL Appalachia are working with our states and districts on a diverse set of projects. To kind of kick off the meat of our presentation today, we are very pleased to have Alan Pratt, the Executive Director of the National Rural Education Association, and Sherry Scott Horner, the Organizational Results and Data Officer at Partners for Education at Berea College. Alan?
Hey, first of all, thanks for the invitation to share a little bit about our organization and then why rural research is so important. I'm going to kind of go in 3 buckets. And the first bucket is, our work and what we do and the work of our research team and our rural educator research team, our publication, they're vital to our organization. They're vital to making connection points to the rural LEAs that we serve across the country and our state affiliates serve. So we think that it's a two-way street of feedback and work and how we can make each other better. So that's the first part for us. The second part, when you're looking at rural research, which at our national conference every year, researchers from across the country come and share their work, but they also come to make connections. And we do that connection piece at our conference even more now than ever before on why it's important to connect with LEAs and why it's important to help our rural schools and rural communities. Our LEAs are in a rather strange situation right now, as many of us across the country. A lot of the money and funding coming to them needs an evidence-based practice or evidence-based kind of assurance of what programs they're implementing. As everyone on this call knows, rural school districts really are underserved, undermanned, or understaffed. So to have the RELs and rural research in general come in and help and provide support, it's vital, because all the practice and plans that go into place have to be evidence-based. You mentioned state agency, federal policy, whatever. A lot of times it's aligned to what bigger or larger areas or larger regions are doing, and we have to kind of translate that or make it mold or fit into what's working or what could work in rural areas. Our rural districts have to be flexible. They have to be kind of out of the box thinkers, and without rural research or rural researchers, just wouldn't happen. We need the support, the backbone of why something is working or why something's not working. And simply put, our directors of schools, our superintendents, our staffs at central office in the schools, they don't have the time or manpower to make that happen all the time. So rural research is vital to our work. It's vital to our LEAs we serve and the state education associations we serve as well. So that's our best pitch for rural research. We must have it to function, and we must have it to have a viable future. So it's now my pleasure to introduce Sherry Horner from Berea College.
Great. Thank you, Alan. And I just want to certainly echo everything that Alan says, as it's alive and real in our communities. I've served as both a member of the REL Appalachia Postsecondary Transitions team, as well as one of the REL App's governing board members. But my role at Partners for Education as organizational results and data officer is really to work towards supporting local schools and communities by implementing programs, building capacity, and aligning systems. That's our work. We're an intermediary to really stand in the gap for rural Appalachian schools and communities that have those limited access to high quality programs, tools, and supports. You heard many of the challenges that Alan named. There are persistent test score gaps, lower college going rates, higher poverty rates, and our education system here in our region is severely underfunded. And with those limited funding opportunities in rural places, and you pair that with a misalignment of available rural evidence-based programs and funder requirements, that creates a greater disparity in our rural places. And so navigating these challenges with Rural App and our partner schools and community, I've really seen the struggle firsthand. So in 2016, I had the opportunity in working with the REL App to really highlight and illuminate this need in our region for more post-secondary non-academic support evidence. So while we have a lot of barriers, I don't want you to miss a key piece. There are a lot of very rich assets that are unique in our region, including relationships, cultural traditions, resiliency. Our region is adapted to technology and innovations. Often there's mental models that sort of folks hold and refute that. It's these assets that can support strong implementation with fidelity if we have rural evidence-based programs available. Often our rural places, we're forced to utilize evidence-based practices or programs from urban and suburban settings. And they often don't face some of the same challenges that we do, such as smaller pools of talent, physical isolation, lack of public transportation, long travel distance, lack of resources, lack of public infrastructure. So many of the programs that are studied in urban and suburban areas that assume a certain level of resources that, quite frankly, we just don't have in our rural context. So instead of implementing evidence-based programs that really align and build on our local assets that we have in rural places, we're forced to implement programs that don't effectively align or meet our local context. And so that creates often what I like to call that Band-Aid or silver bullet approach. So it becomes difficult for our practitioners and our systems and communities to implement programs with fidelity. We also rarely have access to the local experts that it takes to support the adaptation of evidence-based programs. So take a career academy, for example. Evidence-based programs, it allows students at Career Academy to take career-related and academic courses while also acquiring work experiences through local employers. In our rural context, there's a lower density of businesses to serve as partners, challenges recruiting and retaining quality teachers that are going to lead rigorous academic and career-related courses, limited career pathways, and limited career counseling. So what seems like a practical evidence-based program for our region, we just don't have the necessary resources to support implementation with fidelity. Earlier this year, we were working on a grant application to support many of our schools in our regional communities. So our evaluation team immediately began to do an evidence search through What Works Clearinghouse. After filtering for our topics and studies that met standards without reservations, there were 291 Tier 1 studies. But once we filtered those down to meet our rural and our population, we were really only left with 5 interventions to lay against the National Implementation Research Network's Hexagon Exploration Tool. So that's only 5 to select from, even before we looked at fit and feasibility. Our rural youth really are suffering from high poverty rates and have less access to post-secondary transition resources. If we're going to close the gap for our rural students to improve post-secondary outcomes for this population, we must do more research in rural places so there are evidence-based programs that our rural schools and communities have the fit, supports, and capacity to implement. And with that, Rebecca, I'll pass it over to you.
Thanks, Sherry. So as CJ mentioned, our REL Appalachia partners in Kentucky, Sherry among them, came to us wanting to identify these non-academic interventions to support young people from rural and high poverty communities to enroll in and succeed in post-secondary education. So we carried out this systematic review of the evidence on those interventions, particularly for rural and high poverty populations. And in addition to identifying successful interventions, we also wanted to identify those gaps in the research that is available. As Sherry pointed out, there are many assets to rural communities, but there are also non-academic barriers to success in post-secondary education. One barrier is confidence. So research has shown that many rural and high poverty students simply don't believe they can obtain a post-secondary education. And another barrier is geographic isolation. The isolation of rural communities decreases opportunities for learning about post-secondary education, limits resources and career choices. And as Sherry mentioned, rural communities can have a lower density of businesses to serve as partners, and they can have challenges in recruiting and retaining quality teachers, et cetera. And finally, localism in rural communities can be both a strength and a barrier. Localism is a strong connection to where you live, and it can keep students in the region where they grew up. In some cases, that can be positive, but for accessing post-secondary education, it can reduce their opportunities and even their perceived need for post-secondary education. So we're going to have a quick poll, if Laura will launch the poll for us. The question is, do these barriers resonate with you? And you should see the options yes, no, or somewhat. So go ahead and select an option. We'll give you a few minutes and then look at the results. Okay, it looks like the responses are slowing down. Laura, do you want to share the results?
Yeah,
so
there you go.
Go ahead. Can everybody see those? So it looks like for the vast majority of you, these do resonate. We'll want to hear some more detail about challenges when we have a discussion at the end, but also feel free to add them into the chat or your thoughts on these challenges at any point throughout this presentation. So in our report, we defined non-academic interventions as programmatic supports or activities that addressed at least one non-academic barrier. So for example, some of those barriers are knowledge of the post-secondary enrollment and registration process, the challenges of living independently for the first time, adapting to cultural norms of dorm living, or strengthening students' connections to the college community. So how did we go about our study? We conducted a systematic review of rigorous impact studies. Impact studies are those that look at whether an intervention causes changes in student outcomes, such as post-secondary enrollment or completion. And to be included, a study had to meet the evidence standards set by the US Department of Education's What Works Clearinghouse, or WWC, for determining if a study was rigorous, well-designed, and well-implemented. These are complex standards, but they ensure that a study can establish that the intervention causes the outcomes, rather than just showing a correlation, describing outcomes, or explaining the intervention. In addition to these standards, a study also had to focus on non-academic interventions with K-12 students or students in the summer after high school, so students ages 5 through 19, and show evidence of a positive impact on students' post-secondary success. So what did we find? Our initial search found 1,777 studies. Of those, only 65 focused on post-secondary outcomes of non-academic interventions with students in that age group, and only 17 of those met those rigorous WWC standards. So after we applied our last inclusion criteria, which is a positive impact on post-secondary outcomes, can you guess how many of these were included in our final count? Go ahead and put your guess in the chat. Now I'll give a couple minutes for people to respond. So that's anywhere between 0 and 17. We have a few guesses and they look like they're all pretty low. 5, 3, 8. What does WWC mean? WWC is the What Works Clearinghouse. They're the ones that set those rigorous causal impact study standards. Okay, why don't we go ahead and reveal the answer? 8. So in the end, we found 8. You guys were all, some of you were more optimistic, but for the most part, pretty close. There were 8 studies of 5 interventions that had positive effects on post-secondary outcomes in any context. So if you're interested in learning more about any of these interventions, FAFSA support, flight, college counseling, summer counseling, or summer bridge, you can read our full report, and I'm putting the link in the chat right now. So that report describes both the interventions themselves and the outcomes, the impacts they had. Next, we looked at whether any of these had an impact in rural or high poverty contexts. And we found only one intervention that showed positive effects in rural high poverty settings. It was a study of Upward Bound unfortunately the study was old. It was based on the Upward Bound program that as it was implemented in the early to mid 90s and may not be generalizable to current conditions. In addition to Upward Bound, summer counseling and flight also had evidence of being effective with high poverty populations, but not in rural contexts. So there's only one intervention that showed positive impacts in rural contexts. So what in the end we concluded is that there might be gaps in the information that's available on the effects of non-academic interventions on post-secondary enrollment and success, particularly for rural and high poverty populations. So there were very few studies of the impact of non-academic interventions on student post-secondary outcomes at all. But among those, there were many studies that focused on post-secondary interventions rather than K-12 or the transition. These interventions might be successful in retaining students in college or helping them to graduate, but they can't address the issue of students not enrolling or matriculating in college. And additionally, those interventions that take place purely at post-secondary institutions can't be adopted by K-12 schools looking to improve their students' outcomes. In addition to that, most studies did not meet those rigorous WWC standards. That means they can't definitively show that the intervention caused student outcomes. And finally, most interventions with positive impacts, of which there were only 5, but even of those 5, most of them had not been tested with rural or high poverty populations. And as a result, even interventions with positive evidence of a positive impact on students' post-secondary success might not easily translate to these unique communities, as Sherry and Alan have already talked about. So I'm going to hand it back to CJ to discuss some of the challenges in conducting research in rural settings.
Thank you, Rebecca. So, there are 2 significant reasons why there isn't more rigorous rural research. So in order to confidently state causal links in a rigorous study, researchers need a large sample to make sure the patterns they're seeing aren't just due to chance or reflecting pre-existing differences between students. Large studies generally cost more money, and collecting data from a lot of rural districts costs more money than collecting data from just 1 or 2 urban districts to get the same sample size. These challenges aren't exhaustive, and we'll hear from the panelists who will highlight other challenges to rigorous rural research. So why is rigorous rural research important? We know that there is research in rural communities, but it's often descriptive or qualitative. And that means the studies describe what the intervention looks like or trends in student performance. And this type of research is important and useful and can inform design of programs, implementation plans, and ultimately causal studies by providing critical context of rural communities. But this descriptive research does not provide causal evidence about the impact of an intervention on student outcomes. And rigorous causal research can really help us decide where best to invest limited educational funds. And when you choose an intervention that meets rigorous standards, research standards, you have more confidence that it is likely to benefit students. And some funders require use of interventions supported by rigorous research. So what can we do? One way to make sure researchers can carry out more impact studies in rural settings is to set up data systems that span more than 1 rural district. If rural districts join together in a consortium, they can potentially house their data more efficiently, much like in a larger urban district. Similarly, if states can develop strong, accurate, and user-friendly data systems, researchers can gather information from just one place. For example, Virginia has a longitudinal data system that gathers student demographics, test scores, course information, teacher background, program participation, and more. Researchers interact directly with staff who are centralized in the Virginia State Office to describe their study and request the specific data that they need from the longitudinal data system. This can save substantial time and money over approaching individual rural Virginia school divisions. And finally, rigorous research in rural communities can benefit from additional support to offset the challenges of conducting research. This could include external funding or technical assistance to support the development of a data system, or providing resources to work with the increased number of districts needed to reach the larger samples. And networks of rural researchers could also support a strong understanding of the local data and context. So I'm very happy to hand off this part of the presentation to additional voices from the research community to share a little bit about their work, how that intersects with this need for more rigorous rural research, and speak to some challenges and solutions. We'll start off with Jen Ash and Katie Kinninger from the National Center for Rural Education Research Networks at Harvard. Jen?
Thank you so much, CJ. Hello, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. My name is Jen Ash. I'm the director of the National Center for Rural Education Research Networks out of Harvard University. We work with several rural districts in New York and Ohio. I'm going to let my colleague, Katie Kinninger, introduce herself, who works with the Ohio districts, and then tell you a little bit more about our program.
Hey everyone, I'm happy to be here today. I am Katie Kinninger, and I'm the Ohio State Network Manager at Inkern.
Great, thanks so much, Katie. So I just want to give you all an overview of the NCRN program. NCRN guides a network of nearly 40 rural school districts in upstate New York and Ohio through the Proving Ground continuous improvement process. This process engages rural districts in examining their data to understand their challenges, identify solutions or interventions, as we'd say, and pilot and test the effectiveness of those interventions using rapid cycle evaluations, and in particular using rapid cycle randomized controlled trial evaluations. We work with school districts over 4 years on 3 different topic areas. We have worked with our districts on student attendance, and we are currently working with our districts on post-secondary readiness. And lucky for us, for the topic of this webinar, we are gearing up working with our districts on post-secondary enrollment. Our network, or our program, was specifically designed to address some of the challenges that CJ mentioned earlier. So one of the most commonly cited challenges of rural education research is that there are small sample sizes. So our answer to that was we created a network of several rural districts, 40 to be exact, and we guide them to choose common interventions, and then we pool the data to estimate impacts of those interventions. The second most common challenge of conducting rural education research is the cost of obtaining data. Rather than go to all 40 of our districts individually and ask for data from them, we work with different data aggregators in the states. So in New York, those are the regional information centers. We work with about 6 of those to get data versus the individual districts. And in Ohio, we're fortunate enough to have found a partner where we have one data source for all of our Ohio districts. So that significantly cuts the cost of obtaining data. The third biggest challenge is the lack of existing interventions that are specifically tailored to the rural context. And the way we handle that challenge is that's really built into the process that we guide our districts through. Our districts are looking at their own data, basically calling upon their own expertise to select and design interventions, sometimes novel interventions that haven't been tried before, to make sure that it fits their context. We also bring in, when appropriate, national and state experts in the topic areas to find those appropriate interventions. So with that, I think we're going to go on and introduce our colleague and in also working in the Ohio context. So we'll go ahead and pass it off to Ann O'Connell.
Sorry, I needed to unmute myself. I'm Ann O'Connell. I'm from the Ohio State University. And what I'd like to share with you today is some of the work that my colleagues and I have been doing around improving and strengthening capacity for use of evidence-based interventions by districts and schools. So our training program, it's called eBite for Evidence-Based Intervention Training for Education. As I noted, it's an IES funded program. We work with teams and individuals from both schools and districts from within higher education, both faculty and researchers, to strengthen overall capacity on use of evidence-based interventions. And that really, we're using the definition as defined by ESSA, the Every Student Succeeds Act. And by use, we're actually referring to a series of steps across a cycle of continuous improvement. So we refer to this as evaluation capacity building, which involves helping or being able to assess needs to target the outcome of interest, such as post-secondary enrollments and continuation. using clearinghouses and other resources to search for and select an intervention that can be matched to both the need of the school or district and their local context. Planning for implementation and adapting for local context, using evaluation tools and methods for successful implementation and adjustments, and finally measuring and reflecting on outcomes, sharing lessons learned and inputting that information back into the cycle of continuous improvement. So our training program involves a summer workshop, which was actually virtual this past summer, and we're now providing coaching across the academic year to participants on their identified goals that are targeted to their outcome of interest. Our participants are from both rural and urban and suburban districts. And the specific challenges that our training program was designed to address, and that can be particularly relevant to research with rural districts on both development and use of evidence-based interventions, is that these programs and interventions has been mentioned previously, need to fit schools and educators' local context. And both districts and schools and higher education researchers involved in this process can benefit from networking channels and opportunity to network with peers and experts, which of course I think reflects on the valuable work of the NCRERN network. And finally, on the supporting of research use and uptake of interventions through researcher and practitioner collaborations. So our collaboration is between Ohio University and Ohio State University, and we're gearing up now towards our second cohort for our training program. And with that, I think I'll turn it back to the moderator.
Thanks, Anne. So at this point, we actually want to open up the webinar to discussion with the panelists. We'd love to hear your questions in addition to our own. So if you have a question, please go ahead and type it into the chat and we will try to field those as they come up. But why don't we start with the first set of questions that we have around barriers to conducting research in rural settings. CJ and Jen already shared some of their thoughts on cost and size, but I'd love to hear from the panelists about any others, and especially any that are specific to post-secondary transitions or to causal impact research. I'm sorry, I'm not able to see all of the panelists, but so why don't I throw it specifically to Alan. Do you have anything that you'd like to add here?
You know, I think the point that was brought up on bringing, districts together, several districts, I think they mentioned 40 districts across. I think that's a challenge sometimes in rural areas. And I think we see that as the collaboration piece. And I'll kind of go a little bit off the script just for a second. It's almost like, I remember as a child growing up, I asked my dad one day, I said, why is there 2 Baptist churches in a little small town of 50 people? And he goes, because they can't get along. They don't like each other. So they split and jump to across the side of the street. Sometimes in LEAs, we have that issue as well, where county to county doesn't always kind of jive together, and it's hard to bring them together. And then when you do bring them together, some of them are in the sense of they're looking out for their best interest, which I get that part of it, but it's regional, collaborative, mission driven. I think that's the key. So I think that's a barrier sometimes as well.
That's a really good point. Yeah, as we talked about, one of the solutions was to try to create these networks, but it might not always be that simple.
Rebecca, if I could kind of ping off of what Alan is saying there, and so that piece, I love that piece of bringing the districts together, but I'm fully aligned with the challenges that Alan laid out as you think about helping districts to identify that there's common interventions. So we're an intermediary, and at any point in time, we may be serving more than 40 school districts, but even coming in with the same program, with the same program design, but even the way the intervention looks from one district to the next is sometimes challenging in that implementation. So I think trying to even identify between a handful of districts that same common intervention really poses its own challenge, because again, it's about that context and that fit and the local resources that are inside of each of those districts.
Yeah, and well, and actually we have a comment, a question in the chat that is related to that actually for Jen, about what types of policies and processes NCURN has put in place to ensure fidelity across the network.
Yeah, absolutely. I can start to answer that, and then I'll let Katie speak because she's really on the ground. When we identify interventions with our districts, which they vote on which of several options they'd like to do, and I don't know if it's just because we've primed them from the beginning that you may not get exactly what you want, that we seem to have pretty good take up, even though the district sometimes, some districts didn't vote for one of the interventions we end up choosing. But we identify the core components of what those interventions are and really hold them to and emphasize the importance of implementing with those core components, but allow for flexibility around that. And Katie, I'll let you speak maybe with some examples of what that looks like.
Sure. I would just like to add that most of the time they understand the importance of implementing with fidelity, and that's typically not our challenge with the districts. The challenge has frequently been when the individual that's leading the study has so many different other responsibilities that they're trying to manage at once, that the timelines that we typically develop with them often can't go forward as planned because, for example, last year, one of the districts needed to leave a meeting with me because they had to unpack some of the meals off of the bus because that was their responsibility to do. So we weren't able to talk about planning a student success planning intervention at that time because they were pulled elsewhere. So I think the policies that we have built out over time have just been about flexibility, most of all, and working with them to meet their needs above anything else.
That's a really good point too, Katie, is that I think we haven't really talked about yet is, I think that happens at a lot of schools that people wear a lot of hats, but I think particularly in rural schools and districts, people tend to have multiple roles. And so that can be both a challenge and an asset, is that sometimes with talking to people, they know a little bit more about what's going on across the school and district, not just in their own little silo. So we have another question, which is about how have your data collection efforts over multiple years been affected, challenged, or interrupted by changes in state privacy laws?
So I can speak to this a bit. I wouldn't say that we've noticed a change over time, but I'd say that we see a real difference in our data access capabilities across the two states we work in, and that's absolutely related to concerns about privacy. So we work with student information system data, which is not typically in a longitudinal data system, it's because we do rapid cycle evaluations. Like I said, that's able to be aggregated to one partner in Ohio, which is extremely valuable to us. In New York, we work with the individual RICs, but I think the biggest thing we've noticed is particularly we just struggle with data access in New York much more than we do in Ohio. And particularly around post-secondary, we actually purchased the National Student Clearinghouse data that we will be using versus it being provided by the states or the districts. And when we have tried to get to the bottom of some of this, whether it's FAFSA or NSC, a lot comes back to concerns in New York in particular about data privacy and kind of a backlash to previous efforts to centralize data. So it certainly affects our work. And I mean, there are rural districts in every state that could use help like this. But if you were getting started as a researcher, I would definitely recommend, really investigating the data infrastructure of the state in which you're working with, because it's kind of a make or break condition.
And that's another, as you pointed out, Jen, another cost sometimes is the requesting that data. And another comment in the chat was about, I think, going back to Alan's point about getting districts to work together. Is it possible to provide incentives for them to work together? if that's something that anybody has tried.
And you may have a similar experience to us, but I think the fact that you're providing, and we have another arm of this work that we do with urban districts, and that's often something that is paid by districts out of pocket. And so we are subsidized, we are funded by IES, and so we are able to provide this technical assistance free of cost to our districts. So in that way, it's somewhat an incentive. And I don't know if you've had a similar experience being a funded organization.
Yeah, I think that the idea of supporting those kinds of networks and incentives to work together is really very, very important, and especially for smaller districts or smaller schools. One area that they've shared with us about our training program is that hearing from others and learning from others is a very, very powerful experience, both for what works well and what hasn't worked well, and where they've been able to reach out to others for ideas about specific interventions and how that really can be helpful to a much larger community. So I think that the idea of creating a consortium, even if it's smaller or an alliance of different rural areas, that can be a very, very powerful experience. And our training is actually free to the participants, so that's an incentive right there. And we think that the tools and that collaboration opportunity really extends beyond just, say, an interest in post-secondary. It has, other implications for different academic or non-academic areas as well.
So I'm seeing in the chat some support for that, particularly the idea that, as I mentioned earlier, this siloed thing might not be as true for rural educators, where you might be the only one in your school with that role, and the ability to collaborate and meet other people who have that role and other roles can be very valuable. Another question, and I think this is another big thing that we talked about, but hasn't really showed up in this presentation yet, is the issue of varying rural contexts, that there is not just one rural. So can that cloud the consortia data? So if you're getting districts to come together, proximity to an institute of higher education or not, the presence of a specific employer that requires post-secondary degrees, et cetera, those kind of variations in types of rural, can that cloud the data when you're doing those rural consortia? Is that something that any of you guys have dealt with or thought about?
I think it's absolutely something we think about, and it's frustrating because we have to bring together multiple rural districts to say anything about rural. But of course, the more we work in rural areas, the more we see the differences in rural settings. We have districts that are an hour outside of Cincinnati, which is completely different from being 3 hours outside of a smaller community. We would love, I think this is maybe sometimes where some of the descriptive research can come in, because I'd love to disaggregate and look at, even by the NCS designations, of the differences in descriptive trends among different types of rural. But I think even those designations don't get to the bottom of the differences between rural areas.
I would agree with that point about descriptive, and also adding some qualitative research can be really helpful there too. We had a study on mentors for beginning teachers, and we used one of our districts, or one of our sites was a consortium of rural districts in Iowa. And I think we were sort of aware of the fact that every one of those districts wasn't the same. They were different distances from the cities. And that's an issue for centrally deployed mentors being sent out into all these districts. But it was when we actually went out and tried to interview people in these schools in January in Iowa that we realized, what these challenges are really like, how far it really is to go, and what that experience is really like. So some of that qualitative information was at least as important as the quantitative and impact studies. Okay. So someone else brings up the issue of building relationships. No matter where you're working in K-12, it is important and requires embedding more helpers within our school. I'm not sure I totally know what that means. Tawny Detweiler, if you want to unmute, and if there's any question or anything you wanted to share there.
So I'm a college coach for, excuse me, for an organization in Southeastern Kentucky. So, and I'm working within a newer grant, but I do think there are organizations that are available in rural settings providing help. This work is particularly post-secondary, but depending on, it's kind of like Partners for Education. Depending on who you're working with, you could be tailoring your objectives, if that makes sense. But I do think by working within the school, having experience working within the school, you see how many hats people juggle. And even, at the school that I work at in particular, there are 3 different college coaches. So it's me, who's mostly virtual, and then and I do go to the school sometimes, but then there's another one who is within the school, and then another who is with Partners for Education. And having that many college coaches is not as normal, but that extra help, even for a senior class of 60, is so beneficial, and it allows the guidance counselors to do their jobs. And even sometimes, like, it's hard for us, no matter if you're in the school every day or virtual like me, to get the information that you need because of the hats that they are juggling. So embedding those helpers, and I commented on building relationships because I'm not necessarily from Southeastern Kentucky, like part of my family is, but I've moved around a lot. But just building that relationship, no matter who you are, there might be a little bit of a barrier, but focusing on that relationship is so important and really provides that confidence that you all were talking about.
Thank you, Tawny. Yeah, I want to sort of zoom in on 2 of the things that you talked about. One was that it sounds like sort of building from the bottom up of like where are the research questions coming from, and then to the developing relationships. And I think just start to move us into talking about how to address these barriers beyond just cost and consortia, is that going into rural districts and building that trust in those relationships can be really important. And I know from my experience that there can be a real fear of researchers that it's interpreted as punitive, or are you doing what you're supposed to, and helping them see that we know you have questions and you want to have them answered. Let's help you answer those questions rather than let's just get something from you and leave. I'd love to hear from the rest of the panelists other kinds of ways that they have been able to address those barriers.
I'm happy to jump in for a second. I think in our rural context, our rural communities have been so used to having something been done to them as opposed to done with them. And so it's really that importance of that, the strength of that relationship is bringing together those formal and informal networks and really ensuring that our partners in the work, right, that they have voice and decision-making power, and they're there in that network and they're feeling part of the work as opposed to having something done to them. So they're in partnership and doing the work together.
I'd love to hear a little more specifically about how to do that. I will say, as a mostly quantitative impact researcher, I'm not that often involved in that sort of building the relationships, but did once have a study that happens to be taking place in southern Minnesota, which is where I grew up, in rural southern Minnesota. Got to interview somebody who actually grew up a town over from me. And so that was easy. I was able to be like, oh, I know, be able to build that actual direct relationship. But, if you don't have that, if you're not rural yourself, or if you're as we were just talking about, different Philippa's from Minnesota too. Hi, Philippa. So, being able to build those relationships with someone from a different type of rural area who has a very different experience, or how exactly you go about doing that.
I think that one avenue is capitalizing on the shared goal. And, when the outcome of interest is, or if we're talking about post-secondary transition, successful ways to do that, that's a common ground that that I think people can get around. So it's not, I think that all rural areas are different. They have their different strengths, different contexts, but if they're reaching that common goal, then they have a lot to share, despite whatever differences might seem on the surface.
That's a very good point. Let's see, we've got a few things in the chat. Assessing the implementation of common interventions across multiple districts and schools has proven particularly challenging. Frequently relies on the ground implementers, no matter what the training is provided. As a qualitative researcher that works frequently with quantitative researchers and data, have you found any particular variables that are significant in terms of impacting the effect of the intervention? So you mean, Josh, you mean in terms of implementation, like what matters in terms of implementing an intervention?
Yes, I'm curious to know, because again, I'm a qualitative researcher, so forgive me if I'm getting the language incorrect, but as I've seen my quantitative colleagues build models trying to predict, the impact of a particular intervention. We're putting in different variables, race, gender, things like that. I'm curious if there's any contextual variables that are collected from these large consortium, like the level of leadership and things like that, that you have found in the past that make particular impact on the actual intervention itself.
I could comment a little bit from our work, but we're still, like, this year is our first year working with schools and districts selecting and implementing interventions. But one area that seems to be rising to the top in terms of particular challenges is capacity. And I would say that capacity exists on all sides, not just within rural schools and districts, but also within higher education researchers. And I think that your work in qualitative would be very instrumental in helping identify what some of those capacity issues might be. That might not always show up in data that we collect or in data that's being interpreted. A lot of that really helpful information is descriptive and qualitative. So I don't think there's a golden answer to your question, but I think that qualitative perspective is really critical.
So Marcy also points out in the chat, back to the issue of trust and distrust, that this might particularly be an issue for post-secondary transitions because of the lack of a relationship between higher education and rural communities, leading to skepticism or resistance to opening up to that kind of research within schools. And Robin Brandt wanted to know what models of research everyone is employing if you're involving the stakeholders beyond just the school personnel, like students, parents, the community, and employers.
I can speak to Robin's question. So our typical process involves the problem formulation with just the school personnel, coming up with the solution and and then prototyping the solution with parents and students to get feedback. However, our first year of implementing this was March of, starting in about March of 2020. And that was a piece that we encouraged districts to do on their own of the prototyping, but really got left off as a priority. And especially now that we will be focusing on such a narrow group of students, we're just mostly going to be focusing on 12th grade students in this coming year to talk about post-secondary transitions. We are exploring ways to get student voice in the actual solution formation part of it, since we can imagine there can be quite a gap between what school district personnel think might be a good idea and what may actually benefit students. As I know, I'm visiting my cousin right now, and I run ideas by her all the time. She's like, oh, I would never talk to my school counselor. I would never participate in that. So it's really great to talk to actual teenagers. They'll teach you a lot about how they'll react to something.
So we have just a couple minutes left, and Tony put in the chat here a very provocative quote that I actually sort of want to direct towards Alan and see his response to this. So this is from Cubberley in 1922. Managed as it has been by rural people, themselves lacking in educational insight, penurious and with no comprehensive grasp of their own problems, the rural school, except in a few places, has practically stood still. On the national stage, are we still viewed this way? What are your thoughts?
Great question for me to close out. Holy cow. Thank you for the question. I think it's, I'm going to go. Did anyone happen to see the New York Times Magazine piece on rural schools? Came out about 2 weeks ago. I think digging into that, you see some of that narrative of this is kind of stood still. This is how we are. This is not going to change. I'm not plugging our podcast, but we did do a podcast on it, and we looked at it from the sense of what they're saying in the article, what's being said in the comment or the quote. Is that true today? I may be wrong, and you can disagree. I don't think it's the same today. And I think coming out of this pandemic, you're going to see massive changes in rural schools and rural communities. Some for the worse, many for the better. And I think that's how we look at it moving forward. So I don't know if I answered your question, Rebecca, but I did okay, I guess.
I think that's great. Thank you, Alan. And we're just about out of time. So I want to make sure we get to the wrap up here. We have, actually, I'm going to let CJ tell you about the follow-up here. Go ahead, CJ.
So just want to ask all of you if you've enjoyed this webinar, and I hope you have, to kind of fill out this survey. It's really to give us feedback to improve on what we're doing, what things resonated with you, what things we could do better. We'll also send it around in a follow-up email. And I think in the chat, someone asked, was sad that they had to leave this discussion early, and just to say that it will be recorded, it'll be posted, and we'll send an email out to all the registrants when that happens. I just want to end by thanking our panelists as well as all of you for joining us today. I think we had a really rich discussion, and I think that's in part to the great questions and comments from our audience. So if you want to find us, this is where you can. So thank you again.
Thank you, everyone.